Yes, good morning, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here as we are discussing how we can be resilient to weather shocks. And we had a wonderful session yesterday, and even today we've had a wonderful session in the morning. And this session we are having fits within exactly what we have been discussing, but because we've been looking at exports, and one of the issues that has been highlighted is that we are exporting low-value products. As a result, we are not very competitive on the international market. So we need to do more. And I think this session here that we're going to look at on domestic value addition is very, very important. One, we've been told that we export about 837 million worth of coffee, but the global market for people who don't even produce is about 102 billion US dollars. So how can we position ourselves to have part of that pie, because it's there. We have seen there have been a lot of developments in terms of export diversification. And now we can export tiles. We've been exporting them to Kenya and Tanzania, part of that. We are exporting steel, beverages, cement, but we need to export more, as you have all heard, and we need to add value to the products. In the PDM, we looked. We have 18 priority products that we have outlined. We need to see how value can be added on them. These include coffee, cotton, cocoa, cassava, tea, vegetable oil and palm oil, maize, rice, and so on. But there is good news. For example, on coffee, on cassava, we are producing ethanol out of it, and some of it is actually being exported to our neighboring countries. So this is really very important. And I think as we discuss this, we are thinking about the export markets that are available, the regional and the African continental free trade area markets that are there. But not only that, but even beyond. Because, for example, we are exporting some milk products where there's value addition to the US. So the markets are there. It's only the value addition that we should really be concentrating on. And some of the policies, I think we are going to be talking about them to assess what the impact of our special economic zones has been in boosting the economy and also ensuring that we have value added. So I've been helped that all my speakers have been introduced, so I won't go to that, but I'm going to make sure that they keep time, not more than 20 minutes from each one of you, but I think we can even reduce it to 15 so that we can have time for the question and answer session. So without wasting more time, I'll call upon the first presenter, Priya, to come and make a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be invited to participate in this year's Economic Growth Forum. Today I'm going to be presenting some initial findings from research on the extent of integration of foreign investment in the local economy in Uganda and exploring policy options to make the most of FDI. The descriptive findings that I'm going to be presenting today are based on ongoing work on the extent of FDI integration across a number of countries with my co-authors listed here. So the onset of the recent pandemic, of course, came with a significant blow to investment and to foreign investment in particular. But as the economy starts to recover, there's an extremely important role for policy in both encouraging the growth of foreign direct investment and in facilitating linkages to local suppliers that can boost the competitiveness of local production. FDI, of course, plays an incredibly important role in in injecting capital into the economy and generating jobs, growth, and output. But at the same time, a number of different studies across developed and developing countries have shown that FDI has significant positive effects on the local suppliers that they work with. There's two main reasons for this. One is that FDI firms are often export intensive, and therefore they face globally competitive, global pressures to remain globally competitive, and this in turn means they put pressure on their suppliers to provide very high quality inputs. And the second reason is that FDI firms come with new ideas, new technology, new skills that they can share with the suppliers that they work with. So while foreign investment in Uganda has been increasing in recent years, what this investment looks like and the extent to which it's yielding significant returns for the local economy has been largely an open question. And so the analysis that we do tries to fill this gap by leveraging detailed tax administration data and linking this with data on foreign direct investment in Uganda. So, to set the scene, FDI firms in Uganda are engaged in a number of different activities, with a large majority engaged in a large percentage engaged in manufacturing and wholesale and retail trade. These firms tend to engage in activities that offer higher average wages than the average domestic firm, and although it's not pictured here, they also tend to sell a larger proportion of their sales as exports. I think it's important to note that FDI firms are contributing significantly to the local economy. So FDI firms, here and for the rest of the presentation, I'm presenting information on the universe of firms that are both registered for corporate income tax and also appear in VAT transaction data between the period 2013-14 and 2016-17. We're updating this data, and qualitatively we see sort of similar results for future years as well. And what we see is that FDI firms contribute significantly to local sales, to purchases, to trade. Just to give an example, in 2016-17, these firms made up less than 3% of firms in the economy, but almost 50% of exports for that year. And unsurprisingly, as we can see in this table, FDI firms operate at a significantly larger scale than non-FDI firms with higher sales and trade and employment. But the importance of FDI goes beyond its direct footprint. They also affect other firms in the economy. Using transaction-level VAT data, this figure illustrates that the average FDI firm supplies from 40 suppliers in the economy, and whilst they're directly responsible for about 160 employees through their own employment, they're also responsible for an additional 13 employees on average through the purchases that they make from local suppliers. Now, the way that we calculate this indirect employment is that we assume that it's directly proportional to the sales that suppliers sell to an FDI firm. So to give you an example, if I sell 50% of my outputs to an FDI firm, then we calculate that 50% of my employment is indirectly attributable to the presence of an FDI firm. And this is compared to the average domestic firm that operates at a far smaller scale, of course. So we see that domestic firms ordinarily on average supply from 11 firms. They directly employ 29 employees, and indirectly are responsible for an additional roughly 2 employees based on the local purchases that they make. Of course, I'm not at all suggesting that these differences capture some inherent feature of being foreign. It's largely to do with the fact that FDI firms are just operating at a much larger scale. But I think this gives a bit of an idea of what we're talking about when I discuss indirect employment and the impact of FDI on local sourcing. So, accounting for firm size, we then try and compare how FDI firms compare to domestic firms in terms of the indirect employment that they're generating through local purchases. And this graph presents data on the number of indirect employees created for every direct employee that an FDI firm and a domestic firm employs. So the first 4 columns in this graph refer to data for Uganda, and the last 2 refer to data for Costa Rica, which is a country where we have similar VAT transaction data. We have 2 different measures for Uganda here. One is based on using data from the corporate income tax returns on sales, and one is based on using data from VAT transactions. I won't really go into the details here, but these effectively sort of provide a lower and upper bound to what we can say is the indirect employment being generated per direct employee. But I think what's critical to note from this graph is that whichever data you use, we can see that FDI firms in Uganda seem to be generating a relatively similar amount of indirect employment for every direct job they create when compared to domestic firms. So, in other words, relative to their direct employment, we're seeing local sourcing being a similar proportion of inputs for FDI firms when compared to domestic firms. And this is a fairly surprising result. It's certainly not the case for many countries, including, for example, Costa Rica, where we see that FDI firms, for example, source a far lower percentage of their inputs locally, in part because they import a larger proportion of their inputs. So, how do we explain this difference in FDI behavior between a country like Uganda and a country like Costa Rica? So I think one part of this puzzle is the data. If we believe that domestic firms are more likely to engage in transactions with firms that are not recorded in either corporate income tax records or VAT transactions, which I think is a fairly plausible assumption that that's more likely with domestic firms than with FDI firms, then what might be happening is there may be a larger amount of indirect employment being created that we just can't see in the data that we're working with. But I think what's interesting is that in trying to answer this question, looking at data on firm imports and exports also provides another insight into why we might be seeing relatively higher local integration of FDI firms in Uganda. And that's that FDI firms in Uganda, at least compared to Costa Rica, appear to be far more oriented towards the domestic market. So in this way, they're more similar to domestic firms in terms of where they're selling their outputs. And part of this is to do with the types of sectors that FDI firms are operating in, for example, wholesale and retail that are generally less export-oriented. But at the same time, even if we just look at the manufacturing figures, we can see that they're far less export-oriented when compared to Costa Rica. And this is, just to be clear, this is data that shows the percentage of outputs that are being sold locally by firms in Costa Rica in the first table, and in Uganda in the first table, and Costa Rica in the second table. And we have the proportion of sales being sold locally in the left-hand columns, and by FDI firms, and then by domestic firms in the right-hand columns. But the key takeaway here is that even for similar sectors, FDI firms seem to be selling far more to the local market than exporting, and they're much more similar to domestic firms, and this is a different story from what we see in Costa Rica. So in this way, it may be that you could argue that FDI firms do not face the same pressure to import high-quality inputs. And here we're showing the percentage of inputs. Instead of being sold locally, we're now looking at the proportion of inputs that are purchased locally by firms in Uganda and Costa Rica. And again, here what we're seeing is a similar story, that FDI firms in Uganda seem to be behaving more like the average domestic firm when compared to FDI firms in Costa Rica. The exception here is in wholesale and retail, where FDI firms still do import a high proportion of their inputs, a much higher proportion of their inputs than domestic firms, which potentially suggests a role for policy in increasing linkages and potential supply chains from the local market. So, to summarize from what we can see from the data so far, it seems that the data seems to suggest there's a role for policy both in enhancing linkages, where possible, with FDI firms, but also in attracting FDI that can generate high-quality exports and learning opportunities for suppliers. It's important to note that the analysis that I've presented so far has been based on linkages that we can see through the VAT transaction data. The red bars in this figure illustrate what we can learn from this data about the percentage of sales from local firms that go either directly or indirectly to FDI firms. And the key takeaway from this graph is that the vast majority of domestic firms are not selling any of their outputs either directly or indirectly to FDI firms. We only see a very small percentage of firms that are selling them even over half of their outputs, either directly or through a supply chain to an FDI firm. This is compared to the blue-colored bars, which show the same information, but if we didn't have this individual transaction data and instead relied on average sales between sectors. So the blue bars effectively assume that foreign firms and the suppliers that they work with behave like the average firm in their respective industries in terms of how much they source from local suppliers and how much they sell to FDI sectors. Now, this may seem like a very strange comparison group, but I think it's important to note that these sector-to-sector averages are what's often used by governments to try and calculate the benefits of FDI in terms of their local employment and their purchases. And so these are the kinds of estimates that are used in input-output tables in a number of countries. And what's important to note here is that these clearly overpredict the linkage benefits of FDI firms, and this kind of highlights the importance of VAT data in providing new insights into the distribution of benefits of FDI. So, the next step for our analysis is to look at what kinds of firms seem to be better integrated in terms of their local sourcing behavior. And this is, of course, an extremely important question for policymakers when thinking about which types of firms to target. We are looking at this in more detail now, but one thing we can say at this point is that clearly the sector that a FDI firm operates in plays an extremely important role. And what we see is that accounting for firm size, FDI firms that are engaged in financial activities and in manufacturing, for example, are actually generating more indirect employment through their local sourcing behavior than domestic firms that operate in the same sector. And by contrast, FDI firms operating in wholesale and retail, as we've seen, generate relatively less employment than indirect employment than domestic firms operating in the same sector. And this is in contrast with Costa Rica, where again we see that FDI firms operating in manufacturing are far less integrated than domestic firms in the same sector, in part because of their need to import a large proportion of their inputs. So, given the role of FDI in providing capital, jobs, and the potential for raising local productivity, there continues to be an important role for policy in further facilitating foreign direct investment, but with particular attention to the types of firms that can generate significant linkages to the local economy, and also that have the potential to raise productivity of these local firms that they work with. And priorities for attracting this kind of investment include, for example, providing an enabling environment for high-quality investment. I won't go into too many details on this. I think we've talked about it a lot over the last couple of days, but just to say that cross-country evidence does suggest that non-fiscal incentives are particularly important here, including things like access to electricity, to roads, and efforts to facilitate trade that we've heard about this morning. At the same time, streamlining criteria and processes for entry into the market are an important area for policy focus. So in practice, firms often face bureaucratic delays and have to engage with multiple different agencies in order to set up, which in part explains why Uganda performs fairly poorly on the World Bank rankings for ease of starting a business. At the same time, enhancing legal protections around things like land, contracts, and intellectual property, all of which currently garner uncertainty amongst investors, is extremely important. And finally, improving transparency around investment opportunities and the requirements involved in meeting those opportunities, including for public sector contracts, for example, are extremely important. These efforts to attract more competitive FDI need to go hand in hand with proactive policy to encourage and strengthen local linkages. So cross-country evidence suggests that there are two main reasons that FDI firms struggle to work with local suppliers. One is information asymmetries, where FDI firms simply don't know which local suppliers exist and what they can produce. But perhaps more pertinently, there's also an issue where domestic firms often can't produce at the relevant quality or quantity or reliability that's required by FDI firms. Many countries have attempted to encourage the use of local supplies by imposing local content requirements, but I think it's important to note that the effects of these obligatory requirements have been sort of controversial. In a number of cases, they've had a negligible, if not negative, impact on local production. And just to give a fairly historical example, in Mexico, for example, there were very strict local content rules that were initially put in place to try and encourage the use of local parts for vehicle assembly. This did increase local production, but it came at the cost of globally competitive vehicle production, and as a result, many investors left the country. And I think only when there was a shift in policy towards less restrictive local content and a focus more on local capacity building that we saw the emergence of globally competitive production. So this brings me to my kind of next point, which is that I think in the context of Uganda, efforts to facilitate linkages through capacity building are much more likely to result in long-term improvements in local productivity. So part of the role of government authorities will be to work with foreign investors to identify the key constraints that they're facing in local sourcing. But with that in mind, experience from different supplier development programs from across the world suggests that priorities are likely to include, for example, targeted skills training to meet the needs of incoming FDI. So, for example, in Malaysia, SMEs are provided with partial grants to train their employees, but specifically based on curriculum that are determined in collaboration with multinational companies. Another key area, I think, for domestic capacity building will be financial support to FDI firms that are working directly with local suppliers on capacity building through training or product development or other aspects of quality improvement. And these kind of funded collaborative projects have been extremely successful in countries like Chile. I think that's all I have time for, but look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prima, for that wonderful expose. I think you've heard it all about how FDI in this country is helping to boost local competition. When we are comparing with Costa Rica, we seem to be doing much better in that. However, we don't have FDI firms that are engaged a lot in exports as in Costa Rica. So those are things that we must look at and see what ideas we'd have. The other thing that we have she's talked about are the non-fiscal incentives, which are very, very important. And one of them we are trying to do to improve our competitiveness is having a one-stop center. So it's already established in the law. So under Uganda Investment Authority, so we'll see how we can further improve it to ease the cost of doing business. Thank you so much, Prima. So from Prima, we are going to dive straight onto Harriet. Please.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about marketing opportunities for the parish model commodities. So maybe I can get the slides. Yeah, so this is a project that I worked on with Dr. Isaac Shinyekwa and Maya Dennis Makika from EPRC. I think they are in the audience today. So if you have any questions, they were both very tall men. You'll find them afterwards. You ask them the hard questions. Okay. So what do exports have to do with the parish model? I think personally that export markets are crucial for achieving the model's goal to grow the share of Ugandans in the monetized economy. And the first reason why is that exposure to export markets can improve price transmission to farmers. So for example, avocados and tomatoes in local markets are about the same price per kilo. But on export markets, we see that avocados gain around double the price of tomatoes per tonne. So we think that growing cash crops like avocados can help farmers generate extra revenue and ultimately help them to enter into the monetized economy, which is the goal of the parish model. Okay, secondly, I think that understanding which crops present the best opportunities for export development can help to direct extension services, particularly for newer agricultural crops like house avocados, where we've got less kind of embedded experience in producing. We also think that this exercise can help the private sector identify opportunities for investment along the PDM value chains, particularly in cases where Uganda has limited capacity to produce higher value-added exportable products. And lastly, we think that this is important because understanding which products and markets present the best export opportunities can help Uganda Export Promotion Board better target its activities on really tractable and realistic export opportunities. Okay, so the first pillar of the parish model is focused on value chain development, and the original ministerial statement highlights 18 commodities, which are up there on the screen now. So that includes kind of crops, livestock. It says dairy, but it's actually dairy, and some nuts. So since the parish model was launched last year, the Ministry of Agriculture has developed some draft operational guidelines in consultation with the districts. And each district has identified a subset of commodities that it wants to focus on. And here we have an example from Soronco. So they've prioritised coffee, banana, cattle, dairy, fisheries and beekeeping. So some of those commodities are not on the list of the original 18, but that's okay if it reflects what they're very good at growing in Soronco. Okay, so telling farmers what to grow can be a bit risky, right? Crops might not do well in a particular area, or this could cause a surplus of specific products which can trigger a price collapse. I think that the first risk is really well mitigated by working with the district administrations to kind of develop a shortened list that highlights the key commodities that they want to focus on. But the risk of a price collapse can be really devastating for farmers, and it would undermine the objectives of the parish model, which is to grow kind of farmers out of subsistence. So here we've got an example from 2020 of pineapple farmers in Masaka. We had a sort of bumper crop of pineapples, and the average farm gate price fell from 1,000 shillings per piece to 200 shillings per piece and caused really big devastation. We can also think of the price effects of Kenyan import bans on maize, poultry and dairy. Ugandan producers lost a really large off-taker when those import bans were introduced. That caused a short-term supply glut and forced prices down, ultimately having quite bad consequences for the farmers. So how can we mitigate this risk? I think the answer is linking up the parish model with diversified export markets, which have robust demand for Ugandan exports of products. And this is the motivation of this paper. Okay. This is a statement from the Honourable Minister for Finance. I'm not going to read it out in the interests of time, but I think it underlines kind of the motivation for this paper. Okay, so there are two ways which Uganda can grow its exports, either by selling greater volumes of products which we're already quite good at producing to establish markets, or we can try to grow exports by diversifying our basket of products or by reaching new markets. And this is sort of what Alex and Lawrence were talking about earlier this morning. In the trade literature, we call these the intensive and extensive margins of trade expansion. And I think diversifying markets is kind of quite a simple concept to understand. So for the purposes of this paper, we just say if Uganda exports a product to a particular market, then that product-market combination is an established market. So for example, if we're selling oranges to Kenya, then Kenya is an established market for Ugandan oranges. When we talk about product diversification, it's a little bit more complicated. So we say that products are established export products if they account for a greater share of Uganda's total exports than the world average share of that product in global exports. So, whoops, going backwards. Here we go. So here's an example of spreadable butter, and we can see that the share of exports for Uganda is larger than the world average share of exports. So we would say that spreadable butter is an established export product for Uganda. And on the other side, we've got an example of live purebred cattle, and Uganda's exports are smaller than the world average, so that's a newer export product for Uganda. I'm going to show you some examples now, which will hopefully make this a lot clearer. Oh, okay. So if we look at this grid, the left-hand side of the grid is cases where Ugandan exports of that product already reach the destination country. So those are established markets. On the right-hand side of the grid, we've got newer markets for Uganda. So Ugandan products don't reach that market country. On the bottom half of the grid, we have products which Uganda is very specialised at producing. And on the top half, we kind of have the newer products for Uganda. So, for an example to start with, we have green coffee to Germany. So we know from the discussion in the last session that green coffee is obviously a very established export for Uganda. And Germany is a very established market for Ugandan green coffee. It's like almost our largest trading partner. However, our green coffee doesn't yet reach Chile. So that's a new market for an established product. Okay, and we also know that house avocados are a newer product, but but some avocados do reach the UK. So that's a newer product to an established market. And then lastly, we have the example of avocados reaching China. So a newer product and a newer market. No avocados reach China from Uganda yet. Okay, so these are just examples. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we did our analysis now. Okay, so our methodology follows the decision support model approach, which was developed by Northwest University in South Africa, with a few small modifications. So at the outset, we have around 5,300 products in total and 195 different potential trading partners around the world. So if you multiply those two numbers, you end up with a total of just over 1 million product market combinations. But obviously, we want to narrow that million down to a number that we can realistically work with. So for the product listing, we started with the guidance from the Finance and Ministry of Agriculture working documents, and we included all of the raw products on these lists. So, for example, bananas are included as bananas, as well as more processed products that are either already produced in Uganda or that we think Uganda could potentially produce. So, for example, we've got different grades of cotton that firms like Fine Spinners already make, as well as things like instant coffee, which, as we all know, Uganda doesn't currently have the infrastructure to produce, but we think it's a potential export product for Uganda. DEA mentioned earlier that we're now making ethanol from cassava. That one's not on the list. So it's pretty subjective, and I look forward to hearing plenty of submissions from the audience about products that I've missed in the Q&A later. So we map all of these products to the 6-digit HS codes, which are the main detailed product classification used in trade. And from that, we put together a list of 319 products. So then we look at all of the countries in the world and screen them for political and commercial risk using ratings from a Belgian export credit agency. And we sort of want to do this to drop out countries which we think are potentially risky as trading partners. So, for example, Afghanistan drops out at this point. We also screen potential trading partners for macroeconomic size and growth. So we want to identify potential trading partners where the market is growing, not shrinking. And after this step, we reduce down to 160 countries, and we have 319 times 160 equals just over 50,000 potential product market combinations. Okay, so then we use product level import volumes in our partner countries to identify which product market combinations are large and growing. In this step, we apply a bit of sensitivity based on Uganda's level of specialization in that particular product. So there's a higher bar for products which are newer and a lower bar for products which are more established. We then consider the accessibility of these new markets for Ugandan exporters across 3 dimensions. So how concentrated the import market is in terms of trading partners, the tariffs that are applied to Ugandan origin products, and the transport costs that Ugandan exporters would incur to reach those new markets. One limitation of this part of the analysis is that it considers the world as it is today. So, for example, it doesn't take into account anticipated tariff reductions under the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think if we reran this analysis when the AFCFTA negotiations are finalised, we'd see a lot more intracontinental opportunities passing through this step. So at this point, we narrow down, we've gone from 1 million, and we have 7,200 realistic export opportunities. And then the last step of this is just to group the opportunities into the categories that we discussed on the previous slide. Okay, so what are the opportunities? I'm not going to show you all 7,200 now, but the full list is available at that link in the yellow box at the bottom of this slide. So I'm just going to give you some examples in the groups that we discussed earlier. First, we have established export products to existing markets. We have 178 opportunities in this category, and boosting export in this quadrant is really a function of just increasing volumes. Just in the products I've got up here, the numbers in brackets are the export potential for Uganda, And you can see that there's a lot of value just in those products that we have up here. These dollar figures, I should say, are not our own estimates. They're taken from the International Trade Centre's Export Potential tool. And they represent the market share that the International Trade Centre thinks that Uganda could capture in these markets. The International Trade Centre only calculates these numbers for products which are more established. So you're going to have some numbers on the bottom half of the slide that you can't compare to the numbers on the top half of the slide. Okay. So the next group is established products to new markets. And there are substantially more opportunities on this side of the grid, as you can see, over 2,000. Exploiting these opportunities is really a matter of improving logistics infrastructure to connect to these markets and promoting the quality of Ugandan products in these markets. The dollar figures here, again, are the ITC's estimates of Uganda's export potential. And we can see that some of the opportunities on this slide are much higher value than on the left-hand side, but it's important to remember that, and I guess some are smaller too, but it's important to remember that the overall number of opportunities here is much larger, right? So there is much more value on this side than in the established products and established markets. Okay, so next we have newer products to established markets. This is a pretty small category, which maybe is not very surprising. It's very difficult to export products which are newer to reach far-flung markets. The dollar figures on this side reflect the total size of the import market. And I've just put that up there to give you a sense of how large some of these markets are. I'm not saying that Uganda can capture all of those markets, but there clearly are large opportunities here. So I think, yeah, one thing to note is that relative to the size of these filled chocolate bar markets in Europe, Uganda's exports are tiny, something like tens of thousands of dollars. So, the point I'm trying to make is that there's really a lot of room to grow. And expanding exports in this category is a function of kind of developing Uganda's capacity to produce these products at internationally competitive prices. Okay, and lastly, we have new products to new markets. So you can see this is clearly the largest category with almost 5,000 opportunities. And the dollar values, again, here represent the total size of the import market. So we can only compare them to the numbers on the top left quadrant. Expanding exports in this quadrant means increasing Uganda's capacity to produce these products, but also improving export infrastructure along the value chain, logistics capacity to reach these markets, and promoting Uganda's products in these markets. So they're clearly high value, but there's high costs to reach them. Okay, so I'm going to finish off with some recommendations for how we can more efficiently get parish model products to market. And then on the next slide, I'll talk about some different export promotion strategies that Uganda Export Promotion Board might want to employ. So for commodities that are newer for Ugandan farmers, like the Hass avocado, I think that developing targeted commodity-specific agricultural extension services is critical to encouraging farmers to try out these newer cash crops. I think this is more than just providing trainings. It's also access to inputs like hybrid seedlings, fertilizer, potentially tools. The next recommendation is that most farmers in Uganda are smallholders and they can't access export markets by themselves. So having infrastructure for aggregation of harvest is really, really critical. I think there are a couple of value chains that do this really well in Uganda, and there are value chains that maybe could learn from more established value chains. So coffee, we just talked about earlier. We've got some larger cooperatives that are exporting their members' production directly. We've got aggregators like New Cafe who provide direct trade options for smaller cooperatives. And then we have exporters like Kenneth, who we heard from in the previous session, who use the cooperative structure as a mechanism for aggregation. I think this is really something that other value chains can look to for improved access to export markets. Okay, so in addition to farm-level capacity development, increasing domestic value addition requires investment in processing capacity to allow Uganda to produce higher value-added products at internationally competitive prices. The National Agricultural Advisory Service has developed a really nice model for public-private partnerships in fruit processing all around Uganda. And they've set up a number of processing facilities which act as reliable off-takers for farmers while also promoting value addition. Is this microphone okay? Okay. So in Uganda, we already have some really good infrastructure for improving the marketability of our agricultural produce, and these are the national platforms, which are sort of formal networks of private sector producers and industry experts in particular commodities, and we've got some members of the National Coffee Platform here with us today. These platforms provide a really rich source of information on the barriers that commercial exporters face in their specific commodity and potential opportunities for investment along the value chain. So I think I'm in the WhatsApp group of the National Beef Platform, and there's a lot of conversation about FMD vaccines because foot and mouth disease presents a real barrier to exporting Ugandan beef. I think that tapping into the knowledge of these national platforms to develop commodity-specific export strategies can really help Uganda address key constraints to export development in the parish development model products. Okay. Targeted investment in upgrading transport and warehousing infrastructure will support Uganda's export competitiveness more broadly. And we heard from Catherine in the last session that sections of highway in Uganda are the highest cost parts of road in East Africa. Equally, we know that limited access to competitively priced warehousing infrastructure can lead to high post-harvest losses, which ultimately hampers smallholders' ability to participate in export markets. In the last session, we also had a little bit of discussion about trade finance. I think helping firms to access financial instruments which provide cash flow to exporters based on supply contract with importers is a really great way to boost export volumes. Okay, so looking at all of this, there's clearly a lot of moving parts, and I think there's a clear need for one agency to play a lead role in coordinating all of this as a whole of government approach to value addition in the parish model. I'm not really sure which agency should take the lead on this, but I'd love to hear some thoughts in the Q&A at the end of this session. Okay, and then we've talked about kind of how you get the parish model products to market, but we haven't really talked about how to promote these products in these markets or how to prioritise export promotion efforts. I'm going to go back to my trusty grid to talk about how Uganda Export Promotion Board might strategise its export promotion activities and coordinate with the Ugandan Foreign Service to boost the profile of Ugandan products in export markets. So this bottom left corner is really a volume game, and it's just a matter of capturing more market share. I think these are some of the least risky opportunities in this grid, and export opportunities in this quadrant are really good candidates for trade finance, which can sort of help exporters access high cash flows to ultimately increase volumes. In the bottom right corner, we kind of have new markets and established products, and I'd categorise this as a medium risk activity. I think a good strategy here for UEPB and the diplomatic missions is to pick similar products as a jumping off point for export promotion. So for example, Uganda already exports soybeans and sesame seeds to Switzerland, but not sunflower seeds or palm nut seeds. These seem like more tangible export opportunities in Switzerland than, say, for example, woven cotton fabrics, which Switzerland doesn't import at all from Uganda. Okay, and in the top left corner, we have the less established export products, which, despite being newer, still do reach some export markets. I think these are also medium risk. We have some established trading relationships, but the products we're exporting are new and might not yet be being produced at internationally competitive prices. So for the Export Promotion Board, the focus in this quadrant should be guiding investment to produce export products at competitive prices, and for the commercial attaches of diplomatic missions, the focus should be trying to talk to buyers of these newer products and trying to understand perceptions of Uganda's brand in these import markets, and then sort of feeding this information back to UEPB to inform product export marketing strategies. Okay, so the top right, I think, clearly are the highest risk opportunities and highest cost, but also highest value. And I think the strategy here is a combination of the previous two quadrants. So looking at similar products and also increasing capacity to produce at competitive prices. When I think we step back and we look at this grid, the top right corner is kind of high cost, but also high value. And the opposite is true for the bottom left. So it's kind of lower risk and there's lower potential benefit. I would look at the kind of two diagonal, the top right and bottom left, as sort of achievable and ambitious, but potentially a good challenge for Uganda Export Promotion Board. And I'd also recommend that UEPB uses the data it has available to prioritise export promotion activities. So here I'm talking about the list that I put together, as well as some of the tools from the International Trade Centre and Comtrade, and more qualitative information that feeds in from the commercial attaches in Uganda's diplomatic missions. Okay, I think that's all I've got for today. You can have a look at the list at the link on the screen. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Harriet. That was wonderful. I wonder whether in this exercise you've looked at United Arab Emirates, because that's a very important, yes. And then the Arab world. That is something that we've been looking at since the Dubai Expo. We've got some opportunities that have been highlighted. So I thought I would talk about that. The other issue is on standards, because I think it's very, very important. When we're talking about exports of corn to, for example, to Kenya, one of the issues are standards. There's an ESC standard that we must implement that also looks at the kind of warehousing we have. We have a number of silos in this country, but they don't meet the standard. So I think that is very important. So now, after these two papers, we are going to delve into the private sector, what they think about all this that has been discussed. How can we improve, or how is the private sector in Uganda positioned to ensure that there is value addition and we improve on our exports? Mr. Asimwe, over to you.
Thank you, Moses, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll observe protocol, the ministers present, members of parliament, and all the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to speak on behalf of the private sector. My name is Stephen Asimwe. I'm CEO of the PSFU, and here with my vice chair, I think I saw her here, Honorable Victoria Sekteleko. So just to give a bit of perspective, PSFU is a private sector apex body. It's an umbrella body that brings together 12 sectors of the economy, and that's largely manufacturing, agriculture, oil and gas. I think a lot of minerals were discussed, issues on minerals earlier. But also there's the extractive industry, which is part and parcel of that portfolio. We look at trade, ICT, tourism and hospitality, logistics and transport, financial services, professional services, health and education in the private sector context. And recently, I think about 10 months ago, we created a new sector for creatives. So the musicians, people in drama, events management is part and parcel of a growing sector. You know that Uganda's population has passed the 45 million mark. We are inching very close to 50 million Ugandans, and largely young people. The median age is over about 17 years old, and so it's creating both, it's a good thing, but has challenges in terms of dependency And what we do at the PSFU, we are mandated to do 4 things. First and foremost is policy and advocacy for our business people, our private sector, to create a conducive environment and an enabling place to do business and work. The second is to develop our private sector in the form of business development services and increase their capacities and skills to be able to fit in the broader aspects of doing business. But we also engage a lot of partnerships, both local, regional, continental. So we are part of the East African community, where we sit on the East African Business Council. We are part of the COMESA Business Council. We are now part and parcel and a big growth engagement with the SCFTA. And so that is largely to increase our capacities, but we also work multilaterally and bilaterally with the World Bank, the EU, and all these players, but mainly with government, the Ministry of Finance, Agriculture, Trade, all the sectors that I've mentioned. So my topic today has been to discuss the impact of special economic zones on Uganda's economic performance and basically look at the prospects for medium and long term. But generally speaking, what are these special economic zones, or EPZs, export promotion zones? So there's an issue of definition depending on where you come from. So in many cases, EPZs, or export processing zones, some countries call them free zones, others call them special economic zones, or others call them free zones. So it depends where you come from. But largely, it's a place, an area, which has been set up to enhance commercial and industrial exports by countries. And in these places, the governments mostly zone and gazette them and basically give tax exemptions and incentives for people to do business, to process, but mainly for exports. In these places, and I'm glad Mr. Alinda is here, he's the CEO of the Free Zones Authority of Uganda. In these places, in the free zones, so you can import raw materials and actually process and then re-export. So a lot of times you can do the primary processing, but you can also re-export after a few value additions. You can reconfigure items in the zones, and most times these export processing zones mainly are around seaports or around airports, so that there is ease of movement for export, or around terminals or terminals, major roadways, around borders. And you notice that a lot of the infrastructure around the export processing zones has things like warehouses, storage facilities, storage whether dry or cold if you're exporting perishables. There's a lot of labor intensity. There's a lot of creation of jobs, technology, like I said earlier, storage. Now export processing zones are becoming technology intensive. Many times where you lack a lot of the processing materials, raw materials, there's a lot of importation, but it's largely duty-free because you are exporting to another country. If then you process something and get it into the local geographical area, it ceases then to get the incentives. It no longer becomes an export. So a tax is levied, and I think my brother will labor on that. But just to set the stage, I wanted just to create a bit of background. I hope this works. Harriet, you are supposed to help me here. Okay. All right, thanks. That's my tech expert. Thank you very much. I've already given the introduction of what an export processing zone is all about. And so, okay, probably just skip that one for a bit. Yes, so just in general terms, the free zones contribute at least that amount of money in export earnings, and it's a big deal. In the earlier slide, you may have noticed that free zones or export zones are largely last century's phenomenon. They were very small until countries started trading with each other. And if you look at that slide, you'll notice that from about the 1970s through to the 1980s, it peaks around 1995, all the way 2002 goes up to 2018. The numbers are staggering, largely on account of increased business volumes and trade, but also the entrance of one big country called China. And so China, in the last 30 years, has really grown the volumes of export processing zones, or the free zones for that matter. There are hundreds of, if not thousands, of export processing zones. But in Africa, for purposes of comparison, mainly you look at Morocco, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, our neighbor is rising in that area, Ghana and South Africa. And you notice the earnings have been going up for those countries that have established the free zones. In Uganda, and I think Mr. Alinda will talk about it, after 2014, when we set up the Free Zones Act, we started to see a bit of the traction in that area. Now, again, for purposes of just seeing what impact free zones can create, China had a massive leap from about 1979, and it started to show in terms of the impact it had on the economy, in terms of jobs. I mentioned earlier some of the benefits that come. And so it started to grow and leap, if not have a big thing. In Uganda now, literally everything we are importing, most of our imports are coming in from China. And that's largely derived from a lot of the establishment of the free zones that were set up in that country. Just visiting Guangzhou many years ago, you just see hundreds and hundreds of acreage of some of that free zones of literally anything, from light to heavy manufacturing products. So in terms of the status of the special economic zones in the region, you notice that a large part of free zones, in comparison, Eastern Africa has a big share. And by Eastern Africa, I'm even including in countries like Ethiopia, not basically limiting ourselves to the ESC. South Africa is small, but a big chunk of that is South Africa, a bit of that in Central Africa, and you notice that Kenya has a big portfolio in that context of creating those zones. So in Uganda, I needed to put a distinction. I think the question that was posed to us was the difference between industrial parks and then the free zones. So industrial parks, by definition, is basically an area that has been gazetted principally and primarily for industrial production. On the other hand, you can have industrial production or processing, but largely for exports. So for the industrial park, a lot of it, if not most of it, goes into the local consumption, and a tax is levied on those products. So Uganda has increased its capacity since the act was put in place. Now we have 32 free zones, and I think Mr. Alinda will talk about it. But what is very interesting is the fact that this has increased capital investment to close to $587 million, which is, if you look at the trajectory, it means there's been a steady growth, albeit the fact that it started not very long ago. That distribution, as you can see there, in the north, in the east, but mainly in the center. But we hope that, and I think Mr. Linda will talk about that, the need to increase this capacity, and I'll be explaining why we need to increase that capacity following recent developments in the region. You notice that a lot of jobs have been created in the process. Uganda has very good networks now, especially for roads. All our borders are connected by roads, and thanks to the road fund and the efforts that have been put in place, we see that a lot more capital has been invested, electricity, water, and now we're going to have a second international airport in Kabale. I know that government is in plans to establish more industrial parks, but also processing zones around Kabale, which is in Hoima, to ensure that we use that place, that infrastructure for more exports. Why do we need these SEZs? Why is it important that we create special economic zones? And I'm going to talk from the perspective of the private sector. A lot has been shared building up to the discussion here. Our GDP is about $40 billion, largely agricultural-based, minus the gold that has been mentioned. We are looking at trade in services, especially professional services. And I told you that at PSFU, we have the professional services sector, which brings together literally everybody in the professional space, architects, doctors, auditors, accountants, teachers, ICT professionals, name it. So that is on the professional side. But in terms of trade, and again the numbers have been given, we are still very much behind our neighbors, and yet the potential is big. Round about January of this year, the PSFU, in conjunction with other private sector players like the Chamber of Commerce, and working closely with government, Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance, we got together and decided that let us map our immediate neighbors into an export ecosystem. And who are our neighbors? Our neighbors are the DRC, which interestingly, I was just doing some statistics, has a land border of 950 kilometers. So from Kisoro up to Nebi, you have a 950 kilometers space. And this is a place where we have traditionally traded for thousands of years. But if you look at the exports volumes, it comes to about $750 million. What's the potential? The potential is about $3 billion. The DRC has just joined the East African community. Previously, we were coming close to 200 million people, with Kenya, with Tanzania, with Rwanda, with Burundi, and Southern Sudan. So DRC's entry into the EAC is a fantastic opportunity. So with 950 kilometers of road, of border distance, that provides us a great opportunity. It's important that we discuss the free trade zones in the context of tapping into that geographical space. But let's look at the population. The population of the DRC has just passed 100 million people, which makes it the fourth largest population on the continent after Nigeria, after Ethiopia, after Egypt. Then you have the DRC. Uganda is only 45, 46 million plus people. Great opportunity. There are minerals in the DRC. The DRC is a consumptive country. They export a lot of minerals, but they don't take advantage of their agricultural land, which is about 1.8 million acres of arable land. So Uganda stands a very good chance, including, of course, in the fact that we can also manufacture products for them. So we took a study and actually visited the DRC. So we visited Kinshasa, and I'm glad to report that we now have 5 flights a week to Kinshasa on Uganda Airlines. We visited Goma, which is just down south near our southwest border of Kisoro and Bunagana. And it was interesting to see, going through the supermarkets, that literally 90% of the products there are imported. And what are they importing? Milk, chicken, beef, potatoes. The only thing we import from Congo in terms of food is gonja, which is plantain. The rest is exported there. Huge potential. The biggest challenge has been infrastructure. Entering into the DRC on a 50-kilometer stretch from our border areas is a nightmare. We have one of our players at the PSFU who had to transport some equipment. They were doing some work at a mine, and it took them 12 hours to access some of those places. And so strategically, government has decided to do 3 roads. Mr. Chilap, we thank you very much for that effort. I think combined with the DRC government, we're going to do a road from Bunagana, which is southwest in Kisoro, through a place called Ushuru to Goma, about 90 kilometers. We're doing a joint road effort with them from Mpondwe, this is near Kasese, to Beni, about another 100 kilometers, and another road up north in Goli, Nebi area, to Bunia. This will fundamentally change our balance of payments and earnings. But what's critical about that is the fact that we need to create the special economic zones to be able to target that market. And basically align that with roads, with storage facilities, with banks, with insurance, to ensure that we tap in clearly into the benefits. Number 2, improved productivity. Productivity is critical. As my colleagues have said here, a lot of the products that we're looking at, standards, weights, efficiency, delivering on time is critical. Again, you notice that when we did the survey in the shops and supermarkets in those places, we noticed that one of the things that clearly ensures that there is efficiency is the efficiency of delivery and packaging and branding. I mean, the kind of products we found in the supermarkets were from Brazil, from Egypt, from Turkey, and these are things we could have beaten them. But a lot of times there are issues of logistical support, and they need to deliver on time, on the right quantities and the right standards. So this is going to push us from the export processing zone to be able to create a critical mass of quality, of productivity, of volumes and value that will necessitate that our people make a good return on investment. Of course, increase in investment is good. Yes, we need those export processing zones. We've had discussions back and forth with Mr. Linda at the Free Zones Authority, and we are going to soon sign memorandums of understanding with them to ensure that we enter a coherent agreement on how we can deliver on some of these areas. Now, like I said in the beginning, free zones are largely run by private sector. So it is private sector investment, and I'm glad that FDIs were mentioned earlier. How do we incorporate some of these, both local but also strategic partnerships that will ensure that we take advantage? Of course, it will increase our exports. I won't have to mention that again. If you look at the profile of just the road net, the border network. So we have a land border, 393 kilometers with Tanzania, 188 kilometers with Rwanda, 870 kilometers with Kenya, and about 500 kilometers with South Sudan. Needless to say, PSFU took leadership on this. We have been to Southern Sudan. We've had lots of discussions with our private sector on the other side and the government in Juba. The potential is big. We are discussing on ensuring that we improve on efficiency. Literally close to 50 to 100 trucks leave the Ugandan border every day, and they are destined for Juba. The language on the streets is both the South Sudan tribes and Luganda. That's a business language, and that tells you what's happening there. The challenge, though, of course, is the value proposition that we are taking. We are taking mainly raw materials that need to be given value addition. I think that will be discussed later. But more importantly, most importantly, is the element of job creation. I said to you earlier, our population is closing in on 50 million. The median age is about 17 years. We have young people, very educated, over 50 universities, brilliant, healthy, but restless. We believe that creating special economic zones will be able to absorb that number of people. Now, as I go into my concluding remarks, of course, the need for single and multi-farm zones, they can't be single, but those are small. But if they are multi-farms, they actually create a bigger portfolio. So I don't need to labor very much on the differences. The industrial parks are basically mainly for manufacturing, but Uganda Investment Authority is in the lead, and I think they'll have a chance to speak. The single farm free zones, usually smaller, but we believe that the multi-farm free zones will be explained to you by my colleague. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's important that we invest to spur private sector growth in the special economic zones because it will increase on FDIs, and they've mentioned that earlier, exports and creation of jobs, harnessing, of course, private sector competitiveness. But more importantly, we need to start to invest in trade-related infrastructure. Again, a couple of months ago, we hosted, the PSFU hosted the President of Tanzania for a business summit, and we emphasized the need and the point to use and harness Lake Victoria. It now takes 12 hours for a ship to leave Mwanza and be at the port at Port Bell. But what's interesting is the fact that now Tanzania has invested in the standard gauge railway, and in a couple of months, if not a year, we shall have products leaving Dar es Salaam port, and they'll be at Port Bell in less than 72 hours, and we think that's a very good opportunity. But more importantly, we need better roads, and I thank government for that. We need more airports beyond Kabale and Entebbe. We need to do a faster and more robust clearance of goods and services. And at PSFU, we have the National Logistics Platform, which has been working closely with the Trademark East Africa to establish the one-stop border posts. And towards that end, as I conclude, we've been very strong on SCFTA. We have now created 250 export-ready companies, especially SMEs, to prepare them to take advantage of this space of the SCFTA and, of course, the East African community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, we are working on this journey. We started with Priya. She was telling us about how private FDI can help to boost local competition. We went into Harriet, what she was showing us about our very own program, the PDM, and the products there, and how they can facilitate trade and exports. We have also had Stephen taking us through the export special economic zones, and these are essentially really for exports, not so much for local consumption, because when they're established, at least 80% for you to be a special economic zone, 80% of that should be for exports. The 20% may be offloaded on the domestic market, but if it is, then taxes are paid. They're no longer domestic products. And you can't sell them within the ESC region unless you are going to sell them to a free port. But this whole idea of a free port, is catching up. It's not, and I think now in the UK, almost all the ports are free ports. Go to Plymouth, Liverpool, the Thames, all of them are free ports trying to target exports. These three papers are not the discussant, so I would want to invite Hez Kimomo, Alinda, to come and discuss them. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Moses. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. My name is Kimomi Alinda. I'm the Executive Director at Uganda Free Zones Authority. I'm going to discuss 3 papers. I'll be a bit brief. Most of the presenters, actually all the presenters have done a very phenomenal job. I'll start with the FDI and the extent of integration into the local economy. Priya, from your presentation, it is clear that FDI farms tend to be bigger and perform better in all the metrics that you identified, the variables that you identified. However, when you take a close look at the numbers, you discover that, especially for that period of 2013, 2014, to 2016, 2017, you discover that the DDI farms contributed more due to their numerical strength. So individually, the FDI farms do better. But overall, because of the numerical strength of the DDI farms, they have an overall better picture. For example, when you look at the employment, while the average number of workers for the 588 FDI farms you identified have an average of 158 employees, that turns out to be about 92,904. When you look at the DDI farms, because there are many, 17,540 with an average of 26, that's 456,040 jobs. When you look at the sales, again, the FDI stand at about 7.9 billion, while the DDI stand at 16.9 billion, given the data that you use. So what does that tell us? Maybe before we go to that, you also mentioned that the orientation of the FDI is more on the domestic market. That is useful for import substitution, but not very healthy, given that they have capacity to invest more and integrate into regional, continental, and global supply and value chains. And so I would need to target approaches, tailor approaches to see FDI more export-oriented and not in wholesale, retail, food services, and accommodation. We need to see FDI more integrated and with significant linkages to the local economy, backward demand linkages. When we do this, that will enhance the productivity of the real economy, especially from the small and micro enterprises. Now, to enhance the capacity, because clearly we need DDIs, we need the FDIs, but we also need the DDIs. Overall, the DDIs are having a greater impact in terms of jobs, in terms of even exports. And so government needs to scale up public investment in productive assets, such as plug-and-play industrial infrastructure to augment private sector efforts, because they tend not to have the capacity to build these pieces of infrastructure because of some constraints that they have. Now, in doing this, we are guided by Article 79 of the ESC Treaty, of the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community, which provides for encouragement of the development of indigenous entrepreneurs. Market opportunities available for PDM, my friend Harriet. That was a very wonderful presentation. The objective of the PDM is transform society by lifting people to full inclusion, financial inclusion, and prosperity. In simple terms, that is the PDM that we talk about. And of course, Pillar 1, like Harriet said, is very instructive because that's the foundation: production, storage, processing, and marketing. She highlighted that there's a risk of high primary production that may not be consumed, and that creates a surplus. So we may need to intervene to prevent post-harvest losses and price collapse. We need some urgent interventions in the short to medium term. Again, she highlighted commercial diplomacy, which is very important, but we need to develop metrics for commercial diplomacy. How do we measure results in commercial diplomacy? Is this something that we just talk about and go home, or we need to actually put, and Minister of Foreign Affairs is hard at work on this, but I think we need to work with them a little more closely, whole of government approach to ensure that there is not only market access through agreements and free trade agreements, regional integration protocols, but also market presence. We need to be on the shelves of destination markets, supermarkets, and elsewhere. Yes, we access markets, everything but arms in Europe and elsewhere. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we have the ESC, but are we really there in those markets? And what do we need to do to get into those markets? Because market access is not enough. We need to talk about market presence. Yes, aggregation, SPS measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, cold storage where required, light processing at that lower level, maybe at sub-county level, so that these things don't get spoiled. I one time took a trip to Western Uganda, and I went to Kasese during time for harvesting tomatoes. Many of them were rotting. When you take the road to the north, pineapples in Luero area during the bumper harvest time. And we are likely to see this more and more with the PDM. So we need to make the necessary investments to preserve and protect this production and harvest. In the medium to long term, we need to build stronger value chains. Value addition, certification, packaging, branding, and we need to promote sustainability of supply, because the challenge is never production, expanding production. The challenge is value addition for increasing shelf life and marketing. That's where we need to put a lot of focus, while the parishes in the country scale up on production. We may also need to consider scaling up and take advantage of the ESC market, currently at about an estimated $270 billion US dollars, 300 million people. My brother Simwe talked about the Congo market. I don't need to belabor that. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area, 1.2 billion people with a market of $3.4 trillion. That's big. And to me, PDM is just the beginning, because currently we are utilizing just 35% of Uganda's arable land, 35%. But if we scale that up and went to about 100%, this country has the potential to feed 200 million people, sustainably, 200 million people. And so the PDM result chain, the theory of change, will need to be integrated into export mechanisms, because our market is so small, we can't consume all these things. Export processing zones, free ports, frameworks in the region, and also leverage on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area for market access. The Article 23 of the AfCFTA Comprehensive Protocol on Trade in Goods talks about rules of origin, and I think we are talking about 40% originating content, and if you're going to produce a lot more, then will meet this requirement and will be able to sell to the rest of Africa. Food, Angola, you know, they have a lot of oil and got a bit of Dutch disease, and they import a lot of food. 2019-20, they imported $2.4 billion worth of food. This is a huge market for us under the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, the impact of special economic zones on economic performance, after Mr. Simwe spoke, I thought I wouldn't speak again, but he said, I need to discuss this paper. So I'll take time to discuss his paper, but I appreciate the knowledge he has on special economic zones. He's from the private sector. Special economic zones in Uganda are basically export processing zones and free ports. And these are gazetted geographical areas exempted from customs duties and taxes applicable on importation of inputs into the production process and exportation of outputs to aid the production of export competitive goods and services. They are typically outside the customs territory of the country they are located in, and therefore compensate for the immobility of land as a factor of production, rendering them into an important part of the architecture of global capitalism and a key ingredient of international business. They're extraterritorial with special incentives which are absent in the regular economy of the host country. Now, from the presentation, Mr. Asimu indicated that Africa has about 4%, if I got it right, about 4% of the world's free zones. Could this explain why we as Africans export 82% of the world's raw materials and only participate in global export trade at just under 3% in terms of value? Now, look at those numbers. 82% raw materials, world's raw materials, 82%. But your participation in terms of value is just under 3% of global trade in value. And Uganda's share is just 0.02%. Mark that number, 0.02%. I'll just give you an example of India. India, in 2003, went big on special economic zones, free zones, and free ports. At that time, their share of global trade was 0.72%. For 5 years, to 2008, they were able to increase their share by 0.92% to 1.64%. Along that road, they created 14 million jobs. That's the power of special economic zones. So free zones are special purpose vehicles for export-led industrial policy. Yesterday, the PSST mentioned that the most critical economic policy has to do with controlling inflation and interest rates. And I want to say that the next most important economic policy is an export-oriented industrial policy. It has been essential for the success of most high-income and rapidly emerging economies in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So these SEZs reduce the cost of doing business by creating an environment where firms access manufacturing and trade facilities easily in comprehensive model free zones. And I just want to take off a minute to talk about this. You cannot be competitive globally when you have a factory behind a banana plantation and in front there is a school and behind there is I don't know what. That defeats the purpose, because in the global market we compete on two things. One, we compete on quality, and two, we compete on a price. Now, we need to deal with the price side of this competition. by ensuring that our production is, the cost of production is low, so that that can inform our pricing policy on the global market, at the global market. That is very, very important. And so we may need to consider investing in large industrial estates, special economic zones. Power. Take the cost of production of power is 60% generation, 20% transmission, and 20% distribution. If you have a dedicated line going to a special economic zone or a free zone, you eliminate the 20%, and that brings the cost, the 20% for distribution. That brings the cost of production down. And you need to consider uptime. In some of the industrial zones, free ports, free zones that were visited in Ghana, in Jamaica, in Kenya, in China, and elsewhere, uptime of electricity is 99.7% on average, 99.7%. So that is very important for us. Broadband for business process outsourcing and other IT-enabled services. Yes, I note the time constraint, Chair. Given the changing global economic architecture, Uganda needs to remain competitive to attract local and foreign investment. Now, we can either compete on tax incentives or compete on real infrastructure that enables production. The choice is ours. The risk is, with the tax incentives, we are likely to join the so-called race to the bottom. That may not impact the real economy. And globally, these tax exemptions tend to be concentrated in special economic zones where they are easily monitored, evaluated, and controlled. And also investing in value, those investors who go into value addition for locally available raw materials, because the tax that you have foregone, money has already been sent to the bottom of the pyramid, to where production is taking place, so the economy is generally happy. I just want to conclude by saying that just two things. One, free ports are gateways to international business due to their territorial exceptionalism, transnationalism. They can handle, distribute, process cargo that has international origin and or international destination with very simplified customs procedures. There are international logistical interfaces free from border frictions and designed to bring more value in the global supply chains. This is how Singapore, Dubai, and other locations are developed. Free zones are usually economies, they usually help economies in low-income and low-income countries to avoid the cancer of the extractive political economy. The gentleman from coffee was telling us the numbers. When you look at cocoa, for example, Africa, the cocoa bean producers just share 9% of the entire value chain of cocoa. 9%. Germany in 1920, I think, exported 4.2 billion euros of chocolate. I'm not sure whether there are cocoa trees in Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hez. Yes. Thank you all presenters. I think we should give them a big round of applause. Very, very informative, and I think there are so many actionable points we are going to take from here today. And we will not come back next year when the actions have not been taken, or in the 10th or 11th Growth Forum. So I think this time there are actionable points that we must really take from here. On the special economic zones, there is certain things that we also have to look out. They have many benefits. But one of the things I've seen is that some people, where certain activities have been banned or prohibited, they tend to try and get a license as a special economic zone that they are going to export. For example, export of unprocessed minerals is banned in this country. But then you find someone wanting to get a free zones license to export unprocessed, so circumventing the rules. And they say, they always come and say, oh, there is no bar in this law to tell us not to export. So those are some of the problems that come with export processing zone. And I also noticed that people used to enjoy tax holidays. After they end, now they want the same business to be registered as a in a special economic zone so that they can continue enjoying. So those are some of the problems, but if we can address them, then I think we'll go. On local content, Harriet, you didn't seem to have a lot of faith in local content. But I can assure you, in the petroleum subsector, we are doing very well with local content. We have reserved some services for the locals. For example, catering, plumbing, and they are doing well. Actually, there's capacity that has been built because there are standards that the locals must meet, and there are standards that have been built. So it is all not lost on local content when you say, oh, but it's controversial. No, we have seen at least some movements. Now it's open to the rest of the audience, where I'll be taking maybe 3 questions. Then I'll take another 3 because we may take many, and then before the responses are done, we'll have a problem. I'll start here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for a terrific panel. Harriet, in her eloquent presentation, actually listed what it would take for the government and different agencies to move from an export market to the parish, down to the parish, and what has to happen at each one of the levels. You know, you've got the export market with the embassy, maybe the commercial attaché, the platform that might coordinate the information, and then, of course, extension going back down into the parish. My question is, if there were if a commercial attaché in Britain decided that really avocados ought to be exported to Britain, how would you coordinate those various levels of government intervention? And maybe there's a question to the Deputy PS and Ministry of Finance. Who in government coordinates these various agencies at the level of product detail that Harriet is talking about?
Yes. Over to the educationist.
Hajat promised
Hajat
today
Nifuna.
it's 30 seconds, not 5 minutes, 30 seconds.
Thank you, and good afternoon, members. Recently, a couple of months ago,
Your name, please?
Hajat Zawjan Difna. I was listening and watching the president of this country, His Excellency, but there was this coffee expert who was explaining how value addition to coffee processing and what have you would earn us a lot of money. Then I wondered, in this century, that we are still speaking about things that became obvious long time. It didn't make a lot of sense for me. Then my question is, what goes wrong? Where have we not done well? And whose responsibility is it? So I concluded partly that in Uganda, we look at more complicated things and miss out on the simple and start out things. We are here well aware of our potential. The areas that are supposed to push us forward as an agricultural country. So we want to go for the bigger things and leave out the smaller things that we could start with. Cottage industries, for example, have led countries like India and China to different levels. Then two, how much does government, and who is responsible, related to what my colleague has just said, how much does government influence and direct FDIs to align them with our country's potentials and added advantages, guiding us or guiding them to ensure that they are on the right track. They see our country and where we want to go the way we see it. Finally, Haji Kagwa, you have maybe partly promised, but I also wanted to add my third concern, that we are asking, if we had these issues and resolutions in the previous 6 years, when do we sit down to assess our progress over them, our focus and our address and our inclusion of these resolutions to inform the budgeting process, the financing process, and the expenditure program of this country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those are questions for my boss, so he'll be able to answer. There is a hand behind.
He said 20 seconds.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I have a few questions, and I have to acknowledge that I've been deceived in this matter.
Excuse me, the name?
I'm William Oko.
Yes.
Yes. We are talking about export promotion, value addition. We have got investors coming from outside and inside the country claiming to be adding value or to come and add value on, I want to talk about agricultural products, in particular fruits and coffee. An investor is given an industrial park or a place in an industrial park to add value or to process a product, for, say for example, pineapple in Masaka. First year, second year, third year, you see on the bottle it is written pineapple flavored. And I'll put there a photo of a pineapple fruit. But inside it's a flavor. And farmers are slashing down pineapples because they have lost the market. They don't have anybody to buy their pineapples. And yet the other investor was brought in order to add value and process the pineapple. What goes wrong, or what went wrong? Number two, we have never seen these industries. People keep on importing flavors. Can we have these flavors being got from our own products? For example, coffee. We have coffee beverages outside there, but I've never seen a lot of coffee entering any industry that they are going to process that coffee in order to come up with that beverages. So we shall be crying export promotion, value addition, until we discover such small things. Me, I'm a street student. I learned on the street.
Thank you, William. There's a hand here, this gentleman who has not asked, no, the first one, who has not asked.
We also have a microphone that side, don't worry, director, was, just in case.
Yes.
Oh, yes. I'm Sentogo Livingstone. Thank you very much, Mr. CEO, PSFU. What you have presented is so enriching, and I urge you to have a meeting with members of parliament so that they can get that kind of information. There's something which has pushed me, the issue of constructing roads in Congo, which our head of state has been talking about, which will fetch a lot of money through coffee, through our exports. Why should we have a road like that of Tirini, where they just spread this cassava? and not have roads in Congo, because that will increase our exports. So some of these members of parliament at times they confuse the local population by doing away with what the head of state says. So let's push this, and then also look for market. If we do this, I think our contribution as PSFU to Uganda's GDP will increase. Now, another question. Why does the percentage of people who borrow from financial institutions so low? I think Mr. Dr. Suruma can throw more light on this, because it's only at 19%. Why is there that small percentage? Thank you very much.
There.
Yes. Let's first respond to those 4 questions. I don't know. Where's Mr. Chaila? It seems he has left them for...
We could start with the ones...
the one...
as we wait for DST, I think we're about to receive our...
What steps should be taken, and how do we coordinate the agencies? I thought he would respond to that. You want to give an answer? DB, can you come in? Under the program-based budgeting, what are we doing to try and address these issues of coordination in government? Thank you.
Chair and the participants, the program approach helps us to build on synergies, and as the third development plan was being put into place, we tried to identify those lead agencies. And that's why when you look at these programs, yes, they are lead agencies, but there are very many other actors if we are to achieve the objectives of those particular programs. Because like the first program is on agro-industrialization, which looks at not necessarily production on one side, agricultural production, we have to produce, but then we need to add value to that. So the lead agents on that is Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries, working together with the ministry responsible for trade and industry, and the agencies associated with those bodies. At policy level, the Office of the Prime Minister is the chief whip for all government agencies as far as policy implementation is concerned. We are told that we have, even yesterday when PS was presenting, was saying we have not fallen short of policies in this country. Our biggest challenge and weakness is that we don't implement them, or we are not implementing them well. So at the bureaucratic level, the lead agencies are there at the various levels. We have the Uganda Export Promotion Board, which is supposed to help us to get outside there and identify which market is available for which products, including building capacity of our local exporters and producers. I thank you.
Thank you, DB. As the Director of Budget, I think he's told you about the program-based approach where there is coordination and government ministries, departments and agencies when they are focusing on a particular program in government like agro-industrialization. Ajat Zawja, you asked about value addition would earn us a lot of money, but whose responsibility is this? These silos, which we've had all along, because each ministry was working alone as a vote rather than working together, has been one of the challenges that we have had. And going forward, like the Director Budget has said, we are now working under the programs with various agencies aligned to this program, and they will ensure that at least they deliver. And of course, when you look at our programs, then we have the program implementation action plans for each program. It shows the responsibility of each agency in what we take as the program objective. So I think in that way, this is how we are going to take it. Going forward from here, we'll of course write our recommendations and send to the various agencies to ensure that there is implementation. Our government, can it influence FDIs? Yes, to align to a national strategy. Yes, we do. But at the same time, we cannot stop anybody coming to say, I want to come and invest in this. The opportunities, this is open. But we have our strategic areas when you look at them, and we welcome people in those strategic areas. You look at the PDM, for example, the PADM commodities, they are 18. That's where we want to lead people to come and help. But that doesn't mean that if somebody came and said, I have something else, we are going to stop them. But at least that's what I could say. William, investor to add value to fruits and coffee, we bring them, and then instead of that, they don't, they do something else. And they are bringing in flavors rather than adding value to our fruits. I don't know who can answer that from here. Do we have UIA here? Sorry? Peter, yes, Peter, you are here. Peter Munamira, where are you? I saw you this morning. Sorry? He's out. Okay. So, of course, let me try to answer it as the chair of this session. One, we really encourage value addition, and we want to add value to our products. What have we done on this? We have imposed prohibitive, sometimes what I would call the prohibitive tariffs at 60% on a puri that is coming in when it's competing with our fruits like pineapples, like mangoes, so that yes, people can actually be forced to source locally. And we have seen at least some movements where people are saying now it is cheaper to use local raw materials than to go and import. I'll give you just an example of where now our fruits are being used in production of cider. You know cider beer? It's very popular with the youth. So it has a flavor, it has a combination of alcohol and fruits, apples, pineapples, oranges, and a lot of it is going into the production of those ciders. We are no longer importing them, we are using local raw materials. So the movement is there. High tariffs and then encouraging more value addition locally. Mr. Sentogo Livingstone, on construction of roads in DRC, why did we construct the Tirinyi Road, which has no traffic? Is there a return for, oh yes, DB, can you answer his question? And then we are going to have another round after the response. Where are my people with the mics? They're all here, okay. Let DB answer first.
One, Chair and I forget the name of the member who asked the question. First of all, it is not true that Tirinyi Road has no traffic. The challenge that we need to address is by the time government took decision to upgrade that road, definitely it had a positive economic rate of return. The challenge that is there and across the country is how do we enable the citizens that live along that road to harness the potential of that road profitably. yes, they are taking advantage of the tamaka to dry their cassava, but I think if we enforce, if enforcement mechanisms were very strong in this country, definitely, I think the Road Act does not allow that. Equally, from a psychosanitary point of view, I believe as you dry that cassava on that tarmac, you are equally contaminating it. So I think it is an issue of enforcement. Traditionally, these people used to dry that cassava on some big rocks and whatever, which maybe are still not there, or now the road is more convenient for them than going to the bushes where they used to dry this cassava. But what is required of us is just building the capacity of these citizens to take advantage of that road, and the potential is there.
Thank you, Director Budget. So we start with that gentleman there next to you. There's a lady behind. She should also make a response. Then the gentleman next to her. Please, but let's be brief.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I direct this...
the name, sir?
Donald Olama from Greater Nebi. I'm directing this to Mr. Stephen Asimwe. Is there any initiative that the PSU is taking to help the local farms to access funding so that they can be able to utilize these export processing zones? Because it appears they're not taking advantage of these zones because of the challenge of funding, because you need huge capital investment into this. So is there any initiative we are doing as a PSU to address that issue? And then secondly, our local farms, as much as we have markets in neighboring countries, Congo and South Sudan, they seem not to be taking full advantage of these markets. Recently, just before the corona lockdown, there was a senior official from South Sudan government who came to Uganda here, and I interfaced with him, and we went to several farms within Kampala here, and he offered so many, a lot of incentives for the local farms in Uganda to go and access the market in Congo. But up to date, none of those farms has taken advantage of that olive branch. So I'm wondering, what's the challenge that the farms are facing in accessing these markets?
Thank you, Donald. There was a lady behind, and then the gentleman next. I'll come to all of you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jackie Mutesi. I work with Next Media. I want to thank Priya and Harriet for the Global Market Insight. My first question, pardon? My first question is for Harriet. While there's no doubt that we have a lot of work to do to tap into the 7,200 realistic export market opportunities, what can we do on the other end? Because when we get to these markets, for example, the UK, we're not promoted. They buy British produce. They promote their own produce. So what can we do as a country to ensure that our products are well received and not in the fine print, like they usually put it in very small print, made in Uganda?